As I was saying, shh, please, we have bios here that if I read them all, we'd adjourn. So, in order of how they appear here, Jay Travis, I'll just read the first paragraph for each of you. Is that okay? Jay Travis, 20-year history of service and policy advocacy in many communities comprising the Brownsville area. Jay's commitment to equity, social justice, and combating racism has profoundly shaped her personal philosophy and professional goals. Round of applause for Jay Travis. I thought I read that rather well. Thank you for that applause. Okay, next we have Andrea Zopp, a member of the Chicago Board of Education, has been president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League for 4 years. Before that, she held leadership positions with a number of major corporations, including Exelon, Sears Holding, and Sara Lee. Big round of applause for Andrea. Well, Troy, you have the longest paragraph. Look at this. Not bad. I'll just read the first 5 lines. Troy Anthony,
LaRaviere.
As I said, LaRaviere is, I'm not saying anything, Miss Ivy, I know you're watching, is the principal of Blaine Elementary School, one of the highest performing neighborhood schools in Chicago, and a relentless defender of public education. He is a CPS principal, CPS parent, and a CPS graduate. Let's a round of applause for Mr. LaRaviere. Strange that the gentlemen have very long first paragraphs and the ladies have very short paragraphs. I'm not making any judgments. Here we go. Andrew Broy is president of the Illinois Network of Charter Schools, a statewide advocacy and charter school support organization serving 156 charter campuses in Illinois that collectively educate more than 60,000 public school students. Big round of applause for Mr. Broy. Remember, if you have a question, I'm sure many of you do have one already, we'll have young people coming around after our speakers speak, and you collect them, and I'll be as fair as I can in asking the questions. So why don't we start off in the order in which you're sitting here. Ms. Travis, you have 5 to 7 minutes for an opening statement, and that'll be the same for everybody else down the line. Jay Travis, you're on.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Well, I'm here today as someone who deeply, deeply, deeply believes in the right of all children, regardless of their race or income, to receive a high-quality education. As the Renaissance 2010 plan was ushered in, and it ushered in the first wave of mass school closings, which targeted the neighborhood in which I live, and it also ushered in charter expansion, many folks in our community were concerned, and rightfully so. What we know now definitively, which is what we suspected then, is that despite the fact that data clearly indicates that there is no difference in charter schools' performance and that charters do not outperform public neighborhood schools, charters continue to be marketed to students of color and in communities of color throughout this city. I think it's important to make that distinction because charters are not marketed to affluent white communities. This is a highly racialized issue, and you know, I'm deeply concerned because charters have grown and expanded at the expense of neighborhood schools. Many neighborhood schools which have been under-resourced for several years. And we're witnessing, I think, almost a 3-tier education system. Charters which have been described as mediocre interventions by Dr. Charles Payne have continued to grow and proliferate, while the budgets of neighborhood schools have been slashed. For example, in 2013, the budgets of neighborhood schools were cut by over $60 million, and the budgets for charter schools were increased by nearly $70 million. Again, despite the fact that there is no empirical evidence that indicates that charters outperform neighborhood schools. It's also deeply concerning to me that 88% of the students impacted by school actions have been African American students. And some 60% of the students represented in charter schools have been African American students. Privatization should not be the principal option for public education in our neighborhoods. Our neighborhood schools deserve to be adequately resourced and supported. I think what is the most challenging for me as an organizer is that we know what works in schools, but yet we are not providing that to all children in all neighborhood schools. That's the choice that our parents want. That's the choice that our children deserve. Give us access to the opportunity that exists in schools in affluent neighborhoods throughout this city. We know that smaller class sizes work, right? We know that having experienced teachers in classrooms work, right? We know that a robust curriculum with a culturally relevant support for students. We know that wraparound supports for students to address the impacts of poverty. We know these things work, but yet they're not offered. Yes, education is the civil rights issue of our time, but no, privatization is not the answer to that issue. Giving the opportunity to learn to students, regardless of their race or income, is what is at issue here. And in this moment, today, we must leave here with the charge of taking a critical look at the facts as they are. We also know that charter schools have not had an absence of their share of scandals. We know that there have been some charter school operators who have engaged in some deals with vendors that don't quite meet the smell test. I think that UNO and Concept charter schools are clear examples of those. Charter operators who have been politically connected, who have enriched themselves on the public dime and not been held accountable. But thank God, recently, community organizations and labor organizations have moved legislation to hold charters more accountable, so that we don't have to witness these gross situations of mismanagement and abuse. Also, despite my concerns about charter schools, I don't believe that all charters should be shut down. Charters represent approximately some 15% of schools within CPS, but they are a growing part of CPS's budget, close now to taking up about $600 million of CPS's budget.
Ms. Travis, you can try closing.
I'll wrap up.
Yes.
I had the opportunity recently to spend time with a woman named Lucinda Talbot, who is the granddaughter of Lucinda Todd, one of the plaintiffs in the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education case, and to hear about her grandmother's desire for equity. And it hurts me to say that some 60 years after that landmark legislation, education in this country remains deeply separate and unequal. We must implement what we know works in schools for all children, regardless of their race or income. We should not offer privatization as an option for some and offer robustly resourced public schools for others.
Thank you, Ms. Travis, very much. Okay. Ms. Zopp, you have 5 to 7 minutes.
Not surprisingly, there are a number of points on which Ms. Travis and I can agree. The first and foremost is that the most important thing we need to accomplish is that every child in the Chicago Public School District, every child, regardless of race or economic status, has access to a high-quality education. The other thing that we can agree is that we're not providing that in the Chicago Public School District, and we have not been for some time. What we do not agree on is whether or not charters are an appropriate, although I'm not sure, but whether or not charters are an appropriate part of solution to fixing that problem. Charters were started as an opportunity. We are a choice district, an opportunity, an idea to create quality choices for students. And so that's what the process has been. We were right. That started in 1996 and was jump-started again in 2010 with Renaissance schools. And that process has indeed increased quality choices for students. But one thing that I think is really important to remember is what happens with averages and when you lump everybody in. So the idea behind charters was to create quality school choices. And in theory, and in a perfect world, what we would have done and what you would like to have seen is that because we were creating new schools to create quality choices, that all of those schools would be better performing schools and would provide quality choices for our students. We did not do that. Not all of our charter schools perform at the level that we would want them to. Many of them do. The overwhelming majority of them do, but not all of them. So what happens when you lump them together and say, the data shows that charters as a whole do not outperform neighborhood schools, you're right. You're right. But when you take our higher performing charters, over 2/3 of those schools that are high performing, 3/4 of them in the top 3, in the tier 1+, tier 1 and tier 2 schools, they are doing what we chose to have them do, provide what we wanted to have them do, provide quality choices for students. What we need to do, the other challenge that we have with charters right now is we are, as I said, when we started approving charters in 1996, there were none. There are 131 now. So we are close to 20% of the district in terms of the number of approved charters. A little bit less, 15% of students actually sitting in charter school seats. Our process for approving charters, and we also have 200,000 less people in the city of Chicago, well, close to 200,000 less students, 150,000 less students in the city of Chicago, mostly students of color. Yet our process, and we have severe resource challenges, yet our process for reviewing and approving charters remains exactly the same. We're required by law, CPSs, to every year review charter proposals and assess them based on their quality. Currently, under Illinois law, if we turn down a charter proposal, the charter proposer can go to the State Board of Charter Commission, the State Charter Commission, submit their proposal, and that State Charter Commission can approve that charter and compel us to open those schools, which they have done twice. We have to be more strategic when we're looking at charters today, because we're in a different place today than we were when they opened. But the idea that somehow that they are inherently bad as a whole, that they are not performing as a whole, performing well, that is a fallacy. The idea that children are being forced into those schools as opposed to having the right to choose those schools is also a fallacy. So I think we need to be focused on the true facts. As Ms. Travis said, we agree there that we need to be focused on that. Anytime you pull averages together, anytime you start talking about lump sums, you can reach some of the conclusions that Ms. Travis did. But what I do want to recircle back to, I think, is the most important thing, and that is we are committed to the same objective and goal, ensuring that all of our children have access to a quality education. The school, CPS believes that quality charters are an important part of that equation. That said, the other thing that we have not done particularly well, but we are improving, is assessing, evaluating, and closing those charters that are not delivering the way that we need them to. This year's charter warning list has the most charters on it, the schools on it that we ever have. I believe it's 11. And those are schools that, if they do not approve, will be at risk of closure. We need to do that. We need to continue to do that aggressively. And as Ms. Travis said, hold charters accountable for delivering what we expect them to deliver the same way we hold neighborhood schools accountable. We also agree that neighborhood schools are a critical part of any equation for this district. They are the overwhelming bulk of our schools, and that will remain so under any structure that we're headed to. There is no plan to secretly privatize the district. That's not going to happen, and we do need to continue to resource and support our neighborhood schools. So,
May I wrapping up, Ms. Zopp?
okay. Just trying to get my equal time. So there is much that there's much that we agree upon. But I do, holding charters accountable, ensuring getting rid of the ones that are not doing what they need to do, and supporting our neighborhood schools, we certainly concur with, and I believe that we are doing. Thank you.
Round of applause for Ms. Zopp. Now I don't hear it. Does anybody hear like a beeping sound? Yes. What is that? Well, that's not part of this discussion. I don't want to hear that they beep louder for one than from the other. Okay, Mr. LaRaviere, you're up for 5 to 7 minutes. And remember, I am the white line down the middle of the road. All right, go ahead.
Good afternoon, beautiful people. As a CPS employee, technically I'm sitting next to my boss, and I have the great task of contradicting her today.
It will not be the first time that somebody who works for me contradicted me.
Getting good, isn't it?
I also have the task of taking what is normally a 40-minute presentation and reducing it to 7 minutes. As a result, there will be many ifs, ands, buts, and howevers and exceptions that I don't get to cover. I want to acknowledge right now I know they exist, and hopefully they'll come out during the question and answer session. So before we talk about charters, I want to talk about what's a good school, and I want to talk about what's a good school by talking about what's a good teacher. So imagine yourself a third-grade teacher in a low-income community, and you just received a classroom full of students who are 2 years behind. Imagine there's another third-grade teacher in a high-income community just received a classroom full of students that are 2 years ahead. And at the end of that year, you've moved those students a full year and a half in 1 year, but they're still a year behind, and their test scores are going to show it. And the teacher in the high-income community moved her kids about a half a year, but they're still ahead. The test scores are going to show who's doing better. If we just look at attainment, right? The teacher in the high-income community. Whereas we all know, if you move kids a year and a half in a year and the test scores aren't showing it, something's wrong. And so one of the things that happened with CPS, when they began to talk about evaluating teachers based on test scores, they chose a measure that measured student growth rather than overall student attainment. And so how did students grow? You know, we're not going to measure you by what you got. We're going to look at what you did with what you got. And so the measure they chose was the MAP assessment, the measures of academic progress. And so they not only measured teachers' performance, but they also judge schools by this growth measure. And they also, networks of schools also look at themselves by this measure. And so what I did was, this past August, was give myself the task, if they can measure teachers and schools and networks of schools, why don't we take a look at how charters and public schools are doing on this assessment that they measure everything else by? And so what you have in front of you are the results of that assessment. And again, remember, you have attainment and you have growth. Now, we had a theory that charters were skimming top-performing students and were looking pretty good as a result, but weren't doing anything with those students. Is that true? Let's take a look. Page 1A, this is overall City of Chicago. We have selective, magnet, neighborhood, charter, and turnaround. And as you can see, for attainment, Charters in neighborhoods are right at the same percentile, 49.1 and 47.9. And so this sort of feeds into the argument that, you know, charters do about as well as neighborhood schools, but they do it more cheaply, right? If we look at attainment. But I want you to look at the back of that sheet and look at growth. This is the overall growth percentile in CPS. As you can see, charters are at 48.2, and neighborhood elementary schools are at the 75th percentile nationally in terms of the growth that their students undergo in neighborhoods public schools in reading. That's citywide. Let's take a look. One of the things that happened, Mr. Broy, actually, this is a result of a challenge you gave to me. He looked at this citywide data and said, well, let's look at neighborhoods. And so he picked a few places where charters were doing well, and I said, well, let's go look at all the neighborhoods and see how charters in neighborhoods are doing versus charters versus public schools in neighborhoods. So the first one was the North River Commission. The North River Commission asked me to look at their schools in their service area. And so as you can see on page 2A, the attainment results fit that line. You have a charter school on the low end and a charter school on the high end. It's highlighted. You see it? Attainment, based on what the schools get. But if you flip that and look at what those schools do with what they get, you can see charter schools are at the bottom of the barrel in terms of the growth that they foster in the students they get. Aspira and CICS. And this is based on the original charter data that was released, not the altered data, for those who know about that history. Now let's look at West Pullman and Altgeld Gardens. Once again, for attainment, page 3A, once again, for attainment, it fits the line. You have charters spread throughout the distribution. Some are on the low end, some are not quite on the high end, but maybe they're not on the high end because they don't have schools from high-income households. So let's take a look at their growth. Once again, they are the 3 lowest performing schools in West Pullman and Altgeld Gardens. And so we see a pattern here. They're skimming high-performing students from low-income neighborhoods and doing nothing with them. Let's look at Chatham. We have one charter we looked at there was Shabazz. Chatham overall is a low attainment area because it's a highly impoverished area. And so you have low attainment. But among those low attaining schools, the charter there, Shabazz, is one of the higher attaining ones. But what did they do with those students? Flip the page, please. Once again, dead last. Second percentile, where you have neighborhood schools like Brownell at the 97th percentile, Dixon at the 77th. Actually, flip back one more time. Look at the other side of that, right? If you look at Brownell, they're at the 26th percentile. This is the kind of school Emmanuel would have targeted for closure, right? Because of the neighborhood that those people serve. But if you look at what they did with the students they got, they're at the 97th percentile. They do better with their students than 97 out of 100 schools in the entire, 97 out of every 100 schools in the entire United States that take this assessment. And these are the kinds of schools that were shut down a couple of years ago under that shutdown program. Now, let's take a look at some citywide data. This. Top 45 schools in Chicago in terms of growth. All of them in the 99th percentile nationally. There's not a charter school on this list. If you look on the other side, bottom 45 schools in Chicago based on growth. Charter and turnaround schools make up only 17% of the district, yet they represent almost half of the lowest performing schools in Chicago in terms of growth. Flip that page around. We have the bottom 20. The 20 lowest performing schools in reading in Chicago. 13 of them are charter or turnaround. If you look at the charter percentage, 17%, 3 of these schools should be charter or turnaround in proportion to their population.
Mr. Lavier, could you wrap it up? You got Unless you got more charts.
That was, I got about a minute. Is the minute okay?
You're the principal.
All right.
I'm a graduate
But
of public
they
schools.
represent over half of the worst performing schools in this city. Now, 90% of the schools produced by the charter model are in the bottom half of growth. Let me say that again. 9 out of every 10 schools, charter schools, are in the bottom half of CPS performance in reading growth. Our government has no business using public funds to prop up a model of schooling that fails this consistently and this miserably. Yes, parents deserve choice, but government has no business using taxpayer dollars to fund and promote a model for schooling that produces systematically poor options for parents to choose from.
Thank you, Mr. LaPierre. Well done. Okay. By the way, Mr. LaPierre, we do have microphones. Okay.
I should have put this back.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Broy, you can move your microphone any way you like. You got 5 to 7 minutes.
Great, well, thank you. It may not surprise you to hear that I disagree with a lot of what's been said so far. I think the mistake made and the data just showed really demonstrates one of the core problems of the charter debate, which is that we bring a lot more heat than light to these discussions. We just heard an analysis based on 1 year on one content area reading among one sort of school, elementary schools. I will spend my time trying to broaden the focus to see how well charters do in the city overall and how they have contributed to improving the city. In preparing for these remarks today, I came across a couple of editorials that were written back in 2004 in the Sun-Times and Tribune. This was the day after then Mayor Daley announced the plans to open up 100 brand new schools by 2010, the so-called Renaissance 2010 initiative. The Sun-Times and Tribune, both in their lead editorials on that day, June 28, 2004, led with Tribune, bringing real choice to Chicago, and Sun-Times, reform plan is just the push failing schools need to win. So we had, 10 years ago, a rare moment of editorial unanimity in our city. We don't have that today, and I'll talk a bit about why that is. Keep in mind, back in 2004, we had 31 charter schools in the city serving 8,000 students. Today, we have 133 charter schools serving over 60,000 students. So we've opened up 100 new schools in that 10-year period. It's well to ask now, 10 years in, how are we doing? And keep in mind, one thing the editorials make clear is the charter movement existed to do two things. The first was to create new models of schooling that improved the city's overall performance, not just the charter schools, but the city's overall performance. And secondly, to create new options of schools and locate them in areas of the city that did not have access to high-quality schools currently. Well, let's address each of these questions in turn. On the first question, has the city improved in the past 10 years during this era of fairly dramatic charter expansion? And the answer is, indisputably, yes. If you look at test scores, graduation rates, college enrollment rates, every single metric in the city is up over 10 years. And it's been up at a time when the overall student population has gotten poorer in the city, and during a time when income inequality is greater, two factors that in most cities produce depressed academic outcomes. So on ACT composite score, back in 2004, the average ACT in this city was 16.9. To give you a sense of scale on that, the College Board, which administers the ACT, tells us that 21 is the college readiness benchmark. We were fully 5 points below that benchmark at the time. What is it today? In 2014, 18.6, almost 2 points of growth in those 10 years overall for the city. Graduation rate, back in 2004, only 1 of every 2 entering 9th grade students graduated 5 years later, 53% graduation rate. Today, 69.4%, the highest graduation rate we've ever had in our city. College enrollment, how many entering 12th graders or exiting 12th graders enroll in college the following year? 40% in 2004, nearing 60% today, a 20% gain, percentile gain over that time period. So the city's improved dramatically in 10 years. The second question, Have charters had a meaningful contribution to this growth? And again, the answer to that question is an indisputable yes, and I'll try to lay this out for you on each of those different criteria. Over the past 10 years, charter high schools across our city have had a higher graduation rate each of those 10 years, having the effect of bringing the overall graduation rate for our city up. On ACT growth, again, looking at similarly situated students coming in, charter schools represent 14 of the top 20 performing growth schools of all high schools in the city. So I agree that we shouldn't look at just at status attainment, but on growth at high school level, charters are clearly at the top of the distribution. Even if you set aside test scores and look at the SQRP, which is CPS's new measure for evaluating schools, there's a 5-point rating system from 1+ at the top to 3 at the bottom. If you look at just the 2 top rankings, so 1+ and 1, the SQRP rankings this year, of the 15 highest performing non-selective high schools, 12 of those 15 are charters. And SQRP takes into account graduation rate, growth, college enrollment, college placement, freshmen on track, attendance rate, all sorts of metrics, and CPS's own data suggests that charters are leading the district in a positive direction. One question I get oftentimes is this argument. You know, when charter schools laws were passed in 1996 and 1998 in our surrounding states, they were supposed to bring innovation into the system that the system would learn from. What have charters done on that score? Well, I'm here to report the story here is quite good. If you look at what CPS is doing today, many of the innovations started in charter schools. For instance, using college enrollment and college completion as a way to evaluate high school performance. Charters have done it since 1999. Last year, for the first time ever, CPS put that as a metric to judge high school performance. Longer school day, something we fought over for 20 years in this city. Charters led the way in '98 by starting a longer school day for low-income students who had academic deficits that need to be remedied. CPS just did that, as we all know, a couple of years ago. Principal autonomy, giving principals the right to make decisions over staffing, curriculum, resource allocation in the school. Charters did that starting in 2001 under the state law. Now the system does it more broadly. So each of these areas are areas where charters are contributing both to the overall attainment in Chicago, to the sector in Chicago, and then modeling behaviors and practices that can be adapted more broadly. And I'll close with 2 final points before we get to questions. One is the simple fact that can't be disputed, and that is that no one in Chicago is assigned to a charter school. No student anywhere has to go to a charter school. These are parents making choices about the best school for their students, and we've got 15,000 students on wait lists today trying to get into charter schools. So neighborhood families understand something that politicians sometimes don't, and that is that high-quality choice is a net positive for our city and is moving our city in the right direction. And then finally, to the question the panel was posed initially, can district-run schools and charter schools coexist in this city? I think the answer is a clear yes. We are, we have, and we will. In ways that many don't recognize, charter schools are partnering in neighborhoods across the city with other principals to share best practices. Every other major urban city in the country, New York, Los Angeles, DC, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia.
Okay, Mr. Broy, you're...
I'll finish. All of them have major and growing charter school sectors. That's evidence of the fact that this model of education, giving parents choice and holding schools accountable for results while providing them autonomy on the way they get those results, is a model for the future, one we should embrace more of and not have these divisive questions about charter moratoriums or should we grow more charters. The answer is, of course we should grow more charters, and the same way we should grow high-quality schools of all types. I'll final up by saying
well, your time is up.
Okay.
You've had more finals than Jimmy Narani. Round of applause. That last line was for you aging baby boomers. For you young people, the heck with you. I don't really care if you don't know. Okay, that's one, Miss Ivy. That's only the first one. Okay. All right, now, do we have our people to collect the questions? I assume there will be some. The moderator has a question as a proud graduate of Chicago Public Schools. In fact, one of them was in your, Mr. Principal, one of them was in your analysis. I won't say which one, but it ain't doing well. Are you guys playing with the same data? It seems like you're looking at, I thought Springfield budgeting was tough, but this is even tougher. You're all looking at the same data, right? Anyone, jump, anyone. Is there like one official data on all this stuff? Or do you make your own up?
Yes, I think the data is both on the CPS website and on our website for all schools in the city. I try to provide more of a holistic approach across all the high schools in the city in terms of outcomes compared to just one content area.
It just does make, you know, you're talking like it's two different school systems. All right, here we go. Rapid fire. Martha Jantrow, board member and a former Chicago Public School board member. Martha's question, a little bigger writing, Martha. What is the charter school policy concerning suspensions and expulsions? A lot of who's and ahs here.
I would like to comment on it.
Real quick, let's go.
So the answer is that CPS, the charter schools have their own individual policies, although they are required to align with CPS, and we are working with them because as everyone here knows, CPS has had a huge focus in the last several years on reducing expulsions and suspensions. And we are working hard to bring our partners in the charter community in alignment with what we are doing.
Historically, charters have not had to adhere to the same school discipline code as Chicago Public Schools. Many of their discipline policies have been egregious, some of the most egregious, expelling students in some cases at 12 times the rate of Chicago Public Schools. You know, it's interesting to me to hear all of this about graduation rates as well, because, you know, you can boast that, you know, well, 100% of the students graduated, or we have high graduation rates. But if half of the students don't make it to their senior year because they've been pushed out of school, is that really an accurate fact? I would say it is not. And, you know, this is all happening, you know, on the public dime. These are our tax dollars, and we deserve more accountability, which is why many of us want an elected representative school board for that very reason.
We've had that debate here last week. Don't want to get into that again.
Hey, Paul, let me just say something. Let me just say something about data, because that's exactly the point. You're absolutely right. If you count graduating seniors as how many of the seniors graduate, you're absolutely right. But if you count from as of the 9th grade cohort, how many graduated as we do, then it's a different number. And so I think it's just important.
That's not the number that's been touted for schools like urban prep. There's a difference.
That's not.
All I'm saying to you is you can get that data and look at it and answer that question. So it's just an important point to keep in mind when you're talking data. We do look at 9th grade cohort graduating. So I just think that's important for you to understand.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Let's get to another question, because we have a whole,
Oh my God.
this is not a telethon. These are all the questions. You stop, cease. Jay, can we go to 4 o'clock? Here we go. Megan Schmidt. Where are you, Megan? Raise your hand. All right. I assume you raised it. I can't see it. All right. Don't be afraid. This is the City Club. Not much bad can happen to you. Right, Jackie? Yeah, okay. Chicago, International Charter School. What message would you give to the thousands of parents on charter school waiting lists?
That's interesting.
I'd like to address that.
All right. Try and limit yourself, you know.
I will quote a WBEZ News report. They wrote, charter advocates say 19,000 kids are on the charter waiting list. There's just one problem with that number. It's not accurate. It significantly overstates demand. A WBEZ analysis found that the figure counts applications, not students, meaning that if a student applies to 4 schools, he or she is counted 4 times. It includes kids who have turned down charter seats. So kids who have turned down charter seats, they're claiming on their charter waiting list, even though they've already told them, we don't want to go to your school.
All right.
So one point there, the state board's looked into the data, and it's true there are thousands and thousands. 12,000 was the latest data. So the point is, whether it's 12,000, 15,000, 19,000, there are thousands of parents in Chicago who want more charter school options in the city.
There are 5,000 empty charter seats for them to go into. Why aren't they there if there's such a demand? Why are there 5,000 empty charter seats?
Mr. Principal, could you push your microphone a tad away, just a tad away? We don't want any lawsuits on hearing loss. All right.
And the Catalyst reported a decline in 30% of charter schools enrollment. So I think.
All right. Well, I think we need. Oh no, I'm not getting in. I'm the white line in the middle of the road. All right, Diane Hess, where are you? There you go, right up in front. Spencer Foundation. What should the? Oh, that's a good question. What should the word public mean with respect to schools? Sort of a philosophical question. There you go. Jump in, anybody.
I think the simple answer to that question are schools that are funded with public funds. I mean, I think that's part of the point of this conversation. We talk about charter schools like they're not public schools. And as we all know, they are operating within the public system. So I think, to me, the simple answer, public money, public school, which is the whole idea around choice and options.
I think that the public in public schools should mean that the public schools are administered by the Chicago public schools. I don't think that the job of the district is to broker off the responsibility of educating our children to private operators, particularly private operators that in some cases are operating underperforming schools.
Okay.
It's just,
all right, now we have another unbiased question from Mr. Jesse Ruiz. Editorial comment. That's two, Jackie, right? All right, you got me. Could Ms. Zopp and Mr. Broy please clarify how charter schools are funded in comparison to neighborhood schools? Good question.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Go ahead.
There was a claim earlier that charter schools in the budget this past cycle got $70 million more in funding. That's simply due to the enrollment growth in those charter schools. So charter schools are funded like every other school in the city based on student allocation. Charter schools do not receive any extra dollars under the operational budget and in fact have limited access to facilities funding from CPS. So the net budget of what charter schools spend is less than the average of what the net budget of the district-run schools spend on an annual basis.
All right, I thought there'd be more action. Okay. Well, we just got Alfonso. I was going to read your question, but I think it was just answered. I'm trying to be up and back on this, and it's not so easy. Here's an anonymous question. You got to sign your name. I'm doing as fast as I can. Okay, Nancy Brandt, is that it? The League of Women Voters. So you know this is going to be up, down, right down the middle. If charters are claiming credit for the overall CPS improvement, please tell us how many charters are working collectively with their near public schools. In other words, are they collaborating? Is that the question? Working together? Okay.
Great question. And we know in our membership there are dozens of charters in Chicago working in close partnership with other principals in their neighborhood. For instance, if you look at Polaris Charter Academy in Humboldt Park, or Academy for Global Citizenship on the Southwest Side, or Namaste Charter Academy. All of these schools have deep relationships in the community and work with surrounding public schools to make sure those communities deliver better education in the city.
There's an underlying assumption there that charters produce the kind of results that would make me want to partner with them in the first place. That's part of the theory that they would be these places of innovation where free from bureaucracy, free from the need to follow established best practice, they could invent their own best practice. And as we can clearly see, that is not the case. So what needs to happen is that CPS needs to recognize that the innovation and the excellent practice that they were seeking in charters doesn't exist in 9 out of 10 of them, but exist in at least half of the schools that already existed, the public neighborhood schools. That's where we need to look for the practices that are fostering student achievement.
Okay, all right. I bet you don't even need when you make the announcement in school, you just probably, right in the hall. I got it, you don't need a microphone. Right in the hall. Okay. You know, this is the City Club where any question and any person has a right to ask a question, even politicians. This is from Alderman Joe Moore. I have 2 charter schools in my ward. Both are rated level 1. The middle and upper income parents in my ward and their children send their children to private or selective enrollment schools. Shouldn't the low income parents in my ward have the same kind of choice that my upper and middle income parents enjoy?
So what's the level 1 based on? CPS did something really slick underneath the table. If a charter had 90% attainment, they excused them from the growth requirement. And so you might have a charter at a level 1 because they're 90% attainment, but 20th percentile in growth. So that's a charter that recruits a bunch of high-performing kids and does nothing with them, and they get to be called level 1 because of their recruitment practice, not because of their teaching.
All right, well.
Can I say one point about that?
Hey, go ahead.
So
You can
I know one of these schools quite well, Chicago Math and Science Academy. I was there last week. I looked at their data. They're a level 1 school because both their ACT score, their growth score, the college placement rate, and their overall graduation rate is very high. That's what attributes it to level 1.
Also, I think it's important to note that maybe we should look at what we are offering in selective enrollment schools to a select group of people and figure out if some of those practices can be implemented in our public neighborhood schools as well. For all students, low-income students included.
We have a candidate for, Mr. Moore, you have an opposition, right? Yeah. Meaningless, we know, but my position. So, in the name of fair play, because as you know, I'm the white line down the middle of the road, Stacy Finkston, I candidate in the second ward. Where are you, Stacy? Stacy, raise your hand. All right, Stacy. You had a great debate with your 5 other candidates with an outstanding moderator. I'm sure you would agree. Here's from Stacy. Has there been any program in progress? Got to work on penmanship in my reading. Has there been any progress in revising the closed neighborhood schools in a way to benefit the local communities? Doesn't have to do much with this topic, but is there any comment on that? Good question, Stacy. If you get elected, follow through. Okay.
So the process for assessing what we are doing with the closed schools is moving slower than I think any of us want. All of you know there was a commission that was appointed to review, meet with the community and then review proposals. That commission did that, and that report is public, and we are moving on some of those actions and activities, and I don't have the list of what's been done so far versus what the timing is, but the answer is yes, but not at anywhere near the pace that I think we would like.
Okay, well, any other person on that? Because we're coming near the end, and I'm sorry.
I think that what I'd like to say is that what we're witnessing in our community is that local aldermen are taking folks on tours of those schools, and the process is not quite open or transparent, and it is not a process that's allowing everyone to weigh in on how those buildings should be utilized. This is something that we have to keep our eye on. We have to make sure that the people who were most impacted by the loss of those school buildings have a voice in how those buildings are used going forward.
Okay, well.
We shouldn't have lost them.
This is the last question, and all 4 of you have a chance to jump in. I'm sorry for the others, but we're running out of time, and the moderator wants to get out alive, so that's another minor thing. This is from Jeremy. What's your last name, Jeremy? From the Anders. It's a very good question, and all of you could jump in. This was directed to Mr. LaRaviere. The data set you provided is very interesting. Do you have any plans to address Mr. Broy's criticism on the narrow focus? In other words, are we playing data, skipping around with the selective data? You know what I'm trying to say. If I could say it, I would. Go ahead. Are we jumping the books?
I could have shown the math data. Public schools outperform. I mean, we don't, because of the emphasis on testing and reading and mathematics, those are the 2 big data sets that we have, reading and mathematics. In terms of what Mr. Broy talked about in terms of high school graduation rates, I think Ms. Travis addressed that perfectly. They're subject to a lot of finagling underneath the table. They can kick out a student, and when that student, and code them as a transfer, and then when that student drops out, he gets on the public school graduation or dropout roll and not on the charter school dropout roll. And so I chose to focus on the data set that can most clearly be attributed to student performance and what happens at the school, what happens in the classroom, what gives us an indication of the quality of teaching and learning that takes place in the building. And those are the growth measures that were provided. Everything else, in terms of the stuff that Mr. Broy talked about, is subject to a bunch of ifs, ands, whats, howevers, and exceptions that my data is not subject to. You might have noticed I'm responding to his data, but he hasn't said a word about mine.
Mr. Broy, you have a...
Sure, I'd be happy to. So graduation rate is not all that I focused on. I focused on both ACT test scores, on EPAS gain scores, which is the same analogous high school growth measure used at the elementary school level, and the SQRP ratings, which are very, very robust and take into account 12 different measures. So the notion that somehow charter schools are manipulating data to get a graduation rate is not borne out by the facts. I'd also say that people in the city who have made charter schools a political issue and are rooting for charter schools to fail are rooting for Chicago students to fail. And that's not something we should accept as a city.
No, and that has to be addressed. No one is rooting for, nobody is rooting for kids to fail.
Easy.
I mean, just one, you know, and I think that, you know, that has to be addressed. We didn't make charters political. The mayor and the school board has made charters political based on who's awarded those charter school contracts, and in many cases, who's continued to get them. In some cases, these are people that are extremely politically connected.
Okay.
I mean, I don't have to tell you what happened in the case of just one with UNO charter schools. I'm sure you all are keenly aware of that. Concept is another operator. You know, this isn't about rooting for children to fail. This is about making sure that we are not offering mediocre options in the name of improving schools, particularly for children of color.
Okay. Ms. Zopp, you want to conclude?
So I think we have to go back to where we started, because I think it's really important, and this does get lost in the conversation. We have the same objective. No, we do. We do. My objective is the same of yours. How we get there may be different, but we have the same objective. Ensuring that every child in this city has access to a high-quality education. So I think that becomes critically important. We believe, I think the data shows that charters are an important part of establishing that objective and goal, and have been successful. Do we have some charters that need not be there, need to be closed? Absolutely. And are we in process to do that? Absolutely. Do we need to have a more stringent and more strategic process for approving charters as we go forward? Absolutely. Do we need to commit to and support our neighborhood schools? Absolutely. So those things are absolutely true, and we do agree and align on that, whether it's political or not. Our goals are the same, making sure that every child has the opportunity to have a quality education. Thank you.
How about a big round of applause for our panelists? Jay?